Yes, it's recording. Thank you, William Gairdner. Thank you always for coming. It's a huge pleasure for us to be educated by a champion of human rights and freedom and all the good things that Western civilization have to offer. So I'm always happy when you're coming back. It's really a great opportunity. So the floor is yours. Please tell us what is the subject for today and. Yeah.
Well, actually, you just mentioned it. It's the subject of human rights. This has been on my mind for some time, and I'm not speaking as any kind of expert, just as a very interested citizen who's done a lot of thinking and reading about this topic. I think there's a lot of illusion carried by the term human rights, which you just used so easily, as many of us do. And so I think we need to unpack it, like starting with the most basic question: what is a right? And since we're not animals that we're talking about now, animal rights and all that stuff, I'm just interested in the main concept. What is a right? And I have an answer to my own question, which I'm going to put on the table right now and ask listeners to keep it in mind. And then we'll come back to it, especially by the end of the talk, and see if it holds up. There's so much confusion when it comes to defining rights for lots of reasons that to me are just philosophically fascinating. How the term spills off people's tongue, lips, without much thought. And it carries a lot of mystical connotation in modern political philosophy. My definition of a right is that it's a defensible claim. That's the shortest definition I've ever seen. So I'm going to repeat it. A right is a defensible claim. You can say you have a right as a claim, and that claim may be negative or positive. For example, if it's a negative claim, it's basically saying, leave me alone. I have a right to be left alone, a right to think my own thoughts, a right, whatever you come up with. And it's basically negative, telling the government, don't touch me, telling other people, don't touch me. I live with this human right of a negative type. The other type of claim, excuse me, is a positive claim. For example, I have a right to free medical care in Canada. I have a right to Social Security. I have a right to, I don't know, you name it. All sorts of things that the governments, which use these as a lure for votes, have promised us. We then call them rights. So again, a right is a defensible claim. You can claim your liberty to speak or walk here or there all you want, but if the law forbids you to do that, your right doesn't mean anything. Just like if you have a right to private property, which I have, I own a lovely piece of property. Many people own their own homes, their own condominiums, whatever. And nobody can walk up to your door, bang on the door, and just walk in because you have a private property right. But if you can't defend that right by saying to them, hey, this is private property, get out of here. You have no right to enter my private domain. And you quote the law defending private property. The guy still doesn't leave, so you call the police. The police come and read him his rights and take him away because you can defend that right. So that's why I say a right is just a defensible claim. Otherwise, it has no real existence. And now I want to talk a bit about, excuse me, I'm still recovering from COVID, so I'm going to be clearing my throat a little more than usual. I would say prior to mid-century prior to, say, 1950, most rights clashes that I'm familiar with anyway had to do with jurisdictions. For example, federal laws, constitutional laws, versus provincial or state constitutional laws. Who has the right to do this or that, the federal government or the state government, or in the case of Canada, the provincial government, or the municipal government? Like, whose right is it? So most rights discussions had to do with that kind of jurisdictional discussion. And then gradually, I would say, post-war, and I think there's a relationship between the agonies and disasters and incredible cruelties of the two world wars in the first half of the 20th century, and this reaction by way of looking for rights to defend nations, defend communities, and defend individuals against that kind of terror. So gradually the rights discussion migrated into more and more discussion of human rights. I know when I was an undergraduate student at university in the early 60s, I took a class in international law, and the professor was always talking about international rights. You know, what are they? How do we achieve them? How do we make them stick with every country in the world and all that kind of stuff? That was very new then. Now it's kind of old. At any rate, in 1948, the United Nations created something called the Declaration of Human Rights. This was listing the rights which the United Nations thought were held by every human being by virtue of being human alone. You didn't need anything other quality of your being to qualify for those rights. But at the time in 1948, the UN also said, and I'm quoting, everyone has duties to the community, quote unquote, but without actually specifying what those duties were. It just left that on the table. I think because they must have felt a little bit embarrassed talking about a right which had no duty attached to it or no obligation. And I'll come back to this point too, because if you're going to get into a philosophical discussion of rights, you have to get into this discussion of obligations, because there's no such thing as a right that does not create for one person, which does not create an obligation on someone else or on some institution like a government or a corporation or a community bylaw or whatever. So a right is one side of a coin. The obligation is the other side of the coin. And I think it's true that in modern times, we tend to forget the other side of the coin. And we speak about rights as if they existed on their own, detached from all obligation, unless we want there to be an obligation, in which case we call upon it. But here the UN said everyone has duties to the community, as I say, without spelling that out. Then in 1998, there was something called the Valencia Declaration, or the Declaration of Human Duties and Responsibilities. Well, what was this? Well, it was a reaction by the international political community to the criticisms that came with having a Declaration of Human Rights with no obligations or duties. So in the Valencia Declaration, the DHDR, it's short term for it, these human duties and responsibilities were listed. And it mainly states that the duties are to uphold the declared rights of the United Nations. So it's a circular kind of structure we have here. First, the Declaration of Rights, and then the Declaration of Human Duties and Responsibilities, which are mainly to uphold the rights that were spelled out in 1948. As I say, it's a circular discussion here. But the main duties we find when we go into these documents and actually read, I don't know how many of you have read the Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, but I have. And of course, in Canada, we have something called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which doesn't mention duties or responsibilities or obligations of any kind. It's the most fanciful way of speaking I could imagine. But at any rate, the Valencia Declaration does state that duties are to uphold the declared rights of the 1948 document. And examining these things, I'd say most of these duties are of a progressivist, leftist, internationalist, and globalist taint, or policy objectives about the environment, about climate, about universal disarmament, about humanitarian aid, and wouldn't you know, about cultural diversity, and without using the slogan, EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is the mantra that's been tearing all through institutions in North America. I don't know how far this has gone where you are or in Europe, but it's invaded everything that we do in North America now. You can't talk to any institution without confronting this obligation to fulfill the demands of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And those three terms are in themselves self-contradictory, which is another discussion. At any rate, let's move from here to the difference between, say, the North American conception of human rights and what I call the Euro-Germanic conception of rights talk, which rejects the idea of the lone rights bearer. Now, if you read human rights literature in North America, at least, you often see this phrase talking about the lone rights bearer, the individual who bears a right. Now, let's not go too deep here. How can you bear a right? Is it something you can take out of your pocket? Is it a piece of paper that you hold up to a policeman and say, here are my human rights? Or is it like an organ in your body, some kind of mystical quality of being human that is part of you? I fear the latter is the kind of more common conception. At any rate, the Euro-Germanic rights talk, which is quite common in European countries, and by the way, in Quebec, which is the only province of Canada, perhaps even of North America, which takes this position, it says, again, everyone has duties to the community. And in Germany's so-called basic law, Article 6 of its basic law, it devotes an entire section to the protection, I'm quoting, the protection of family relations. Wow. I can tell you there's nothing in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that mentions family relations or protecting the idea of the natural family. And one of the reasons is that many of the people who put that document together thought we should use the word families, plural. No such thing as a natural family. That's just a kind of a holdover from a biased and ignorant neoconservative past. What we should talk about is families. And of course, that's gone so far in Canada now with this thrust towards homosexual marriage, which we now have, that they'll talk about a marriage as being a union of any two persons, quote unquote, any two persons. So it's just the most bizarre situation. So let's say two retired guys from the Army who just want the benefits of marriage, of which there's about 100 laws that give you marital benefits. They can say, you know what, we're not homosexual, but we're friends. Let's get married. And we can take advantage of all these legal and economic and tax benefits of a married couple. Oh, yeah, sure, okay. So there's nothing to prevent that in Canada because we don't have fornication police who go around from house to house trying to figure out if the couple that says it's married is actually conjugal. Now, conjugality is the basis of marriage in most modern countries, by which they mean conjugality comes from the Latin term conjungere, which means to join together. Well, you can't join two penises and you can't join two vaginas, as I have said before. So how can they use conjugality as the basis of a free-for-all marriage where any two persons can say they're a married couple? At any rate, they don't go around inspecting these households to see if there's, in fact, conjugality of some kind. Because, as I say, for homosexual couples, sexual conjugality is impossible. So this, anyway, ends us. I don't want to go off on that topic right now. It's a big topic. But let's just say that in terms of rights, that's how far the thing has gone in Canada with respect to common law marriage. As I say, no mention of family rights in the Canadian Charter. As for the Americans, and I'm contrasting the Euro-Germanic and Quebec setup, because Quebec is more like a European country in Canada, with the American-Canadian rights talk. There's no mention of duties, no mention of responsibilities, no mention of obligations in either constitutional document. And I would say that the influence of modern American law and the U.S. judgments of the U.S. Supreme Court have had an outsized influence on human rights law all over the world. And people keep an eye on how the U.S. Supreme Court comes down with its judgments, and then those judgments, the basis for those judgments tends to spread to other jurisdictions. So the trend was to move from a focus on limits and balance and moderation in the concept of rights to what I call hyper-individualism, the idea of the rights belong only to individuals, not to civil societies, not to the community, and moving to the terms, expression of these terms in absolutes. You have an absolute right to something. That's how the language goes, for example, in Canada's Charter. And there are no social or moral limitations specified for those rights. Now, there may be social and moral limitations that pop up when these things are adjudicated in a court, but there's nothing in the actual documents which actually limits these things socially or morally. So this hyper-democratic trend, as I call it, because is a movement from the sovereignty of God to the sovereignty of the lone individual, descending over time, and we've talked about that before. How sovereignty goes from God to kings, to princes and aristocrats, to finally ends up in the lone individual, and not in society. So we could say that this whole business amounts to an attack on the sovereignty of civil society and the rights of the traditional family, where the individual gets to dictate what the rights are, not the family. And this comes out in administrative ways too. When I was a young man, we used to have a family health card, and when you went, whatever, it would be a family health card. Now it's an individual health card. And when it comes to things like social assistance for teenagers and whatever, no one asks you about your family. So some young kid who comes from an incredibly wealthy family, but he doesn't happen to like living there anymore, he falls upon the generosity of the state, and the state does not ask him about his family's wealth. They simply start dishing out monthly payments if he qualifies, whether he's wealthy or poor. So again, it's about the individual, and the family is a concept which is left behind as a basis for judgment. So anyway, again, the U.S. and Canadian constitutional law makes no mention of limitations by a moral code, as I say is the case in Germany and in Quebec. Canada had a case called the Swingers case, which I have mentioned before. It was a sexual swingers club that was created on top of a convenience store somewhere in Montreal or somewhere else in the province of Quebec. And local citizens objected to it because they saw men and women going in and out of this place who were there just for free sex with anybody who happened to come by the club. And they thought it was a terrible example for young people to know about that and to see it happening. So they complained, and it went to the court. And the court ruled in the favor of the operator of the Swingers Club. And in doing so, they actually cited as a support for their reasoning the harm principle which we find in John Stuart Mill's little booklet called On Liberty, which is probably the smallest and most influential little political booklet ever written outside the Communist Manifesto, perhaps. As I say, most people haven't read the whole thing. They read the first part, which includes what is now called the harm principle. And that's simply the idea that you can do anything you want, as long as you don't harm another person. So this was new in Canada and maybe in the courts of the world. This Supreme Court in Quebec actually quoted Mill's harm principle in its defense of the Swingers Club and said they weren't harming anybody. They went there by their own volition to have, open sex time with each other. And so it was none of the community's business, was what the court was basically saying. And so I would say that today the harm principle has been set up as a competing principle of limitations in Canadian law. And where where lawyers and judges want to, they will go to the Swingers case to defend the harm principle and bypass the idea of offending community values. That's gone. So now let me move to another thing which is fascinating me lately, which I think is an indication of rights thinking in the world and certainly in North America. This is a question of what are called duty to rescue laws. Now, there are two kinds of laws here that matter. One's called a duty to rescue. The question is, do you have a duty to rescue someone who's in trouble? I mean, as a citizen, and so on. And the other one is called a Good Samaritan law. Now, the first kind of law, the duty to rescue law, basically says you have a duty to help that person who just had an accident. The Good Samaritan law doesn't say that. But what it says is if you decide to help that person, here's aspects of the law which will protect you or not protect you, as the case may be. For example, if you try to help someone who needs help and you make the situation worse, you could be liable for harming them yourself. But Good Samaritan laws kind of cover that end of it. What I'm interested in is whether or not countries have what's called a duty to rescue law. And now there's a famous case which you'll find quoted in law books almost all over the world, where an Olympic swimmer, this is an example of a young girl who's drowning in a swimming pool, in the shallow end of a swimming pool. So all somebody had to do was jump in. They didn't even have to know how to swim. Jump in and pull her out. But the idea here was, and it's incredibly offensive, I think, to most people's sense of duty, because in America, there's no duty to rescue in any U.S. states. Maybe one or two have tweaked that a little bit and have a modest duty to rescue clause, but almost all U.S. states, and I think most American provinces, not including Quebec again, have no specific duty to rescue law. So the idea in this example is that an Olympic swimmer, who's an incredibly accomplished swimmer, can see a young girl drowning in the shallow end of a public swimming pool. He can pull up a chair and drink a beer and watch her drown. He has no obligation to jump into the water and pull her out. Now, when most law students hear that, they're just up in arms. How can that be? How can we have a situation where there's no duty to rescue? But that, in fact, is the way the law in America has ended up. And a very good commentator on rights, what she calls rights talk, Marianne Glendon, wrote a book some time ago in which she said, I'm quoting, "We live in a nation of strangers. We are strangers to each other from the point of view of having any legal duty to rescue." Now, there's another textbook case I'm going to mention because it probably even shows up in your legal textbooks in Israel. But in most of them, it certainly does. It's called the Kitty Genovese case. Now, Kitty Genovese was a 26-year-old New York woman who was making her way in the world, running a bar for the owner. It was a bar operation. And she went home at about 2:30 in the morning after closing up. And she was just walking through the alleyway on the way to her apartment building when some guy just jumped out of the shadows and stabbed her in the back 3 times. She screamed and yelled very loudly and fell down, but she wasn't dead yet. So for quite a while, she was crying out, help, 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 you know. Nobody came, apparently. And then this half an hour later, this guy came back and stabbed her again. And this time he also raped her just before she died. And then he ran off. Now, as it happened, just to follow the case, somebody down the street heard the ruckus and saw him running towards his car. And he disabled the guy's car. I guess he popped the hood and pulled off the spark plug cables or something like that. So the guy couldn't get away. And in fact, he got caught. But the New York Times came out with a story, which is called the Kitty Genovese story. And it's in the book I have read recently by Marianne Glendon, in which she says it was terribly distressing because, get this, 38 people heard this woman screaming. Some of them even watched her being stabbed and raped, and nobody interfered. Not a single person did anything. Well, the Kitty Genovese story appeared in the New York Times.
How many people, William?
38 people who were milling about, passing on the sidewalk, looking in the alleyway, listening from their apartment windows. I don't know. But the New York Times, which at that time was a credible newspaper of the left, it's always been on the left. Now it's so left-wing, it's just lost all credibility, even with progressives. But at that time, you could read the New York Times and you would expect high journalistic standards. So this guy wrote the story about 38 people, none of whom came to her assistance. Well, as I say, this went around the world, and now you can find the Genovese case in law books everywhere. But it turned out later, about 20 years later, someone looked into it a little more deeply and discovered that, in fact, there were not 38 people who witnessed this terrible event. There were perhaps 7 or 8 people, a couple of them people in apartment buildings who thought it was just some hoodlums shouting, did call the police. And one woman went down and held Kitty's head in her lap until the ambulance came and took her to the hospital, where she died of her knife wounds. But at any rate, the impact of the Kitty Genovese story was simply to reveal the absence of duty to rescue laws in America, which, as I say, most people still can't believe that they're that widespread. And there are lots of other stories, maybe not as dramatic as that one, but there are lots of other stories just like that. And of course, it is a difficult area to adjudicate. In Canada recently, a couple of years ago, we have a highway here which is famously dangerous in snowstorms in the winter, and you can get complete whiteout where you can hardly see anything. And these 2 guys were driving along, and they saw somebody's rear lights flashing in a car that had pulled over on the side. So they thought they would be good Samaritans. And so they said, we need to help. So they pulled over in front of the blinking car, got out and found a woman stranded there, crying, whatever, what am I going to do? She didn't know what to do. And so they went around to the back of the car and opened the trunk to get a spare tire out, intending to change her tire. Whereupon another car came sliding through the snowstorm and smashed into them and killed both of them. I mean, just a terrible story. And the way that ended up is that the woman's, or the girl, whoever was her parents, sued the families of the Good Samaritans who stopped to help her. So I'm not saying it's an easy realm of law to adjudicate, but it's certainly an interesting one. But going back to the duty to rescue, I think that's the most powerful indication of the willingness of a society to see itself as connected in community or not. So to say they live in a nation of strangers in America, I think is quite true. And as I say,
William,
yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about that, if I may?
About
About the duty to help.
Yes, the duty to rescue.
The rescue.
Yeah, it's called. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
No, if I'm interrupting you, then you can continue. But I would just like to analyze this point a little bit more with you, if you allow it.
Yeah, sure. So, as I say, America has no duty to rescue laws in any of the 50 states, except maybe 2, which recently have modified their laws a bit to create some kind of basic duty to rescue. But in the other ones, you have no duty to rescue. The swimmer does not have to rescue the young girl drowning in the pool, and so on. And in Quebec, it's the same. Quebec has a duty to rescue like European countries do, in which you are expected to behave. And this is a phrase I dragged out of Quebec constitutional documents as a bon père de famille, which in French means you are expected to behave as a good father of the family, or, and to put it in other words, as a reasonably prudent person would do. By the way, duty to rescue laws, where they do exist, they don't ask you to go to extraordinary limits to help somebody or to put yourself in danger at all. But they do give a sense of the profile of the country in which those laws exist. You see, so much for the right to be rescued.
Yeah, but can I ask you a few questions about that?
Yeah, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I am personally, I have a little bit of a problem with that because I think that the legal system or the laws shouldn't put any kind of duty on anyone, because if a politician decides something, it's not necessarily make it right. It's supposed to be based on the morality of the people. The people who are actually sharing the same space, the same environment, they should care, and they should be the ones to make the decision to go and help someone. Because if you take it a step further, then the duty to rescue can be applied by the government to force the population to rescue a lot of other things that they deem important. And then eventually they can use people under coerce to coerce them to do things in the name of the greater good, the common good, and all the rest of it. So I think that if you remove the education system and if you allow people to actually become more moral and not to be interfered with the government and those policies, then maybe if they behave morally, they would choose to help the other and to be more involved. But as soon as it's something that is decided by a legal structure, I think eventually it may start with a good thing, help that woman who was raped, but eventually it can get out of proportion.
I understand what you're saying and why you're saying it. I think what you're arguing is it's better if the duty to rescue occurs spontaneously and freely in the citizens than if it's dictated by law. Am I correct?
It's a little more than that. I propose that the government, through its institutions, especially the education system, is removing basic morality from mankind, or turning them into lazy people who are not investigating the question of morality. So they don't have the proper tendency to do the right things for the sake of doing right things. And I believe that if you remove that and you allow people who care about each other to interact peacefully, eventually they will also be very empathic, they will be very caring, and then they will always, in most cases, will help. But as soon as you put the obligation as a duty, then there is no end to what they can define as duty.
Well, I don't know where to go with that, because I understand, I think what you're saying. You'd like it to be more natural and spontaneous and free rather than legislated. And I guess the question that needs to be resolved is, what happens to a society in which there's no duty to rescue and citizens are in fact discouraged by the laws from helping each other when they're in distress, which is the situation we have now in the U.S. There's a ton of stories about people walking by women getting raped right on the sidewalk or walking by people who are about to get shot, and the hell with it, I'm out of here. So I think I understand what you're hoping for. It would be nice if the world worked that way. The long-term analysis would have to be taking a look at societies in which there is a duty to rescue and societies in which there is not, and asking yourself, where's the better place to live? Certainly, I wouldn't want to be in a deadly situation and have everybody walking by me, just looking at me by, and all that. And it would be nice if it would just sprang from them spontaneously. I agree with that.
But William, what is the root cause for this terrible circumstances that in a society where you don't have the law to and the duty to rescue, people just don't care? How does it come to that? Because naturally people do care. I think some of the reasons for why they don't interfere and don't do anything is because they're always afraid that there will be consequences to their action by the system.
Well, maybe we could come back and say if there is a duty to rescue, they're somewhat protected because they're in fact obeying the law, which obliges them to at least try to help. It doesn't oblige them to do everything possible, but it certainly would get them in trouble if they just walk away.
So what do you do then, for example, with the duty to rescue the entire population from the corona? And then in order to allow it, you have to force every man, every woman and child to take the experimental injection. And you would say, you would put it under the duty to rescue the population. Or if you recognize a certain group that may be considered like an enemy, and then you say, in order for you to secure and rescue the rest of the population, you have to get rid of that very small, dangerous community. How do we stop it? Like, where do we put the limits?
I think they're good questions, and I don't know how we stop it. I think there's no end to the possibilities of human evil, and most of these types of laws which are created have optimistic intent, at least when they begin, but there's nothing that prevents an evil government or political operator from turning them into something evil, an instrument of evil. There just isn't. So what that comes down to is the good sense of humankind, in terms of judging these things accordingly. I think you're putting your finger on real dangers, which we're all familiar with. You could say the COVID situation was an example of that, although I have said before in my discussions of that, and let's not get into COVID right now, is that if COVID was in fact 100% fatal, we would be doing exactly what we have been doing, except much more stringently. But it wasn't 100% fatal. And this opened the door for all kinds of objections and abuses of freedom and so on.
Yes. Well, thank you for answering me. Please go on with your lecture.
I tried. I tried. At any rate, as I say, I would rather live in a society where there was at least some minimal obligation to rescue than in one in which help was repudiated and defended. Repudiation was defended in the courts. I think that's a very lonely situation. And I think that's why in the Euro-Germanic law, they have, in the German situation, they have a whole Article 6, as they say, excuse me, which spells out this duty to rescue, which is very limited. It doesn't ask you to be a doctor or to be, a messiah or something and resolve the situation entirely, but it certainly would come after you if you just walked away, like the swimmer walked away from the young girl drowning. So anyway, the topic for today has generally been the question of human rights. And I want to speak historically just for a moment and say that when the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was published, and that was August 26, 1789, it provoked a tremendous amount of reaction. Two of the most important reactions were English. Edmund Burke wrote a letter to a French friend. Imagine, it was supposed to be a letter, like, 10-page letter, in which he was critiquing the Declaration, which had just been published by the French Assembly. And it turned out to be one of the most famous 200-page books in political history. I don't advocate to most people that they read it because it's a bit of a struggle. You have to really be devoted to unwinding Burke's complicated thoughts and sentences. But when you do, you will be richly repaid. It's a beautiful work in which he took to task the French politicians who invented their declaration. And by the way, when he did that, he was roundly critiqued in England by all kinds of people, like the poet William Wordsworth and other people who thought this was just French Declaration was the most wonderful statement of human rights ever. And they took him to task. But then when the revolution turned sour and it transformed itself into the terror of the 1790s, Burke suddenly looked like a prophet. Holy moly. How did this man see it coming? How did he know where it was going? How did he know that the reason was this Declaration of Human Rights that was the cause of the terror? And all of a sudden, his stock went up considerably amongst in the public and amongst intellectuals, as someone who foresaw the difficulty of human rights documents of that kind. The other person who wrote a critique of the French Declaration, in this case it was a point-by-point, shorter critique, but it was just devastating to those who support the idea of human rights, was Jeremy Bentham. He wrote an article, which I mentioned before in this program, called Anarchical Fallacies. It was published in 1815. And he took the Declaration apart piece by piece, and I can't do that for every bit of it here, but we're just going to do a bit of it to see what he was getting at, because I think he was quite correct. And I also think that since 1815, frankly, there has been no credible rebuttal of his arguments. And many progressives have tried to refute his arguments in their own way, but I don't think they have succeeded. And it really is amazing when you think about it to see how someone, 200 years ago came to grips with a document which overturned the whole Western world in terms of revolutionary thinking, and rubbed their noses in it, and no one has been able to refute his arguments since. But before I get into his document, kind of point by point, I just want to discuss briefly the difference between a natural right and natural law, because the two are easily confused. And I'll just be brief and say that natural rights are variable. And also, as we have seen from the history of that term, whereas in the middle of the last century, most human beings would agree with the United Nations Declaration and say, okay, there's about 40 or 50 natural rights that we can agree upon, which are true for all human beings. Now there's 300 or 400. There's 300 or 400 of them. And the language of natural rights has just become crazy. For example, one of the natural rights you have, it's listed in some of these modern documents, is the right to a toilet. And I think it's nice if everybody has a toilet. But to say you have a right to a toilet implies that someone else has an obligation to supply you with a toilet, or to make it possible for you to have a toilet if you don't have one. You can see the kind of circle of obligation that rights sets up. And just before this talk, I looked at one of the many sites you can Google on human rights. And here's one which I think is a full display of the idiocy and the looseness of these conditional terms. This site said a right is a freedom of some kind. That doesn't tell us anything. A right is a freedom of some kind. You could say this is part of my definition, that it's a negative claim. I want to be free of somebody's laws or imposition on me, and in that way I'm free, but it doesn't specify what the kind is. It just says it's a freedom of some kind. And then it says the full scope of human rights is very broad. They mean things like, here we go, choice and opportunity. And I'm going, please. I mean, humans can't get through the day without choosing anything. They choose to get out of bed, choose to put on their socks, choose to have breakfast, choose to go to work. And what is opportunity? You can't dictate opportunity. Opportunity arises or it doesn't. You can create your own opportunities and so on, but it doesn't mean you have a right to that opportunity. It just means you've been creative and you've created it. Like as when you invent something or think of a job that someone might want done, that becomes an opportunity for you. Here's another one. The freedom to obtain a job or adopt a career. It's careful language. To obtain a job, you mean by force or simply accepting a job that's offered? Fine. But if no one's offering a job, if there are no jobs on the market, what does the freedom mean? It doesn't mean anything. Or to adopt a career. It's all careful language. Adopting a career as opposed to training yourself and advertising yourself as having certain skills which someone else might want to pay for. And then we have selecting a partner of one's choice and raising children. Well, selecting a partner of one's choice is always nice, and most people do choose to marry, although it doesn't talk about marriage right here. It says select a partner of one's choice and raising children. But you have no right to select a partner, because what if the partner doesn't want to be selected, right? They have no obligation to obey your selecting them as a partner. So it's a moot point. You know, people fall in love and become partners or married couples because they want to, not because they're exercising a human right. And raising children, again, is a natural biological reality of all human existence. And there are questions about interference of the state with how you raise your kids, for sure. And I have big objections to the hegemony of private schools in free societies. I think we should get rid of the damn things because they've been become huge bureaucratic entities. We should get rid of them and privatize all education and only look after the truly needy in terms of financial supports if they need it. Here's another one. A human right includes the right to travel widely. Really? What does it mean to have a right to travel widely? You know, first of all, most people have to pay for their own travel, and they're happy if they can afford it. And the right to travel implies someone else has the obligation to let you into their country, which they won't if they don't want to. So you can't force them to. And here's one I really like. The right to leisure. Now, it's interesting that Karl Marx, in his writings, had a dream like Rousseau, that all human beings would work in the morning, and in the afternoon they would have leisure. They would paint, do paintings or drawings of their friends, go fishing, or in Rousseau's term, lie under an oak tree, eating an apple. You know, that's what the afternoon would be like in the perfect world. And in rights language, this is going to be a right, the right to leisure. So in other words, you can force other people to let you have your leisure. Otherwise, what does it mean to say you have a right? Now, the other thing, the objection then, is that these rights are way too numerous and too variable. They include too many things. There's a new one coming around the corner every day. And the second objection to natural rights is the notion, which Bentham gets to, and I will get to, is that rights are anterior to government. that rights exist before governments come along. And that's why you supposedly can force governments to honor your rights. It's not clear that rights are anterior to government or law. In fact, one of Bentham's arguments that we'll get to is that they depend intimately on laws that permit them. And lastly, as I said already, rights tend to focus on the individual rights bearer or the lone individual, and they dismiss entirely the idea of the rights of civil society. Now, if you're of a conservative mind like I am, and like Burke was, and many other people are in our time, you have to think in terms of civil society having rights, if you like. Now, those are usually expressed in the form of law, but often they're just expressed in the form of custom and tradition. Like, obey your parents, listen to your minister when he preaches to you, whatever. These things are not laws, but they're part of custom and tradition, which have to do with the direction of your society, not just with your direction as an individual. So much for natural rights, which I think have been exploited and exploded beyond all reasonable question. And now I just want to mention the difference between those and natural law. Now, natural law has been around a long time. Probably the most famous exposition on natural law was by the Roman Cicero at the turn of the millennium, before the year 1. He wrote about natural law, which he said is timeless, it's constant, it's universal, excuse me, and it's transcendent. We don't know how. And it's limited to a variety of natural laws. Excuse me. And I think it boils down to, and this is my definition of natural law, so I'm quoting myself here, and I think it stands up. Natural law is a command of right reason that follows nature for the common good, quote unquote. So it's a command of right reason. It's something you can't help doing. Just as, by the way, with reference to our earlier discussion, most people cannot help rescuing someone in trouble. So in a way, to have no duty to rescue is like opposing a natural tendency. Maybe that's what you were talking about, Harry, earlier. Excuse me.
Bless you.
So, most people want to help someone in trouble. So it's a timeless constant that in the case of the Twin Towers in New York City, we all remember, excuse me, the firemen who rushed into those towers. They knew they were probably going to die. But the ones who didn't, and a lot of them did, who got out, why did you rush into a burning, collapsing tower? I can't believe what you did. You know what they all said? I could do no other. I couldn't help myself. I had to do it. So this is what Cicero means when he's talking about human nature in connection with natural law and transcendent values, which apply to all human communities. And in my book of absolutes, and we talked about this in one of our sessions, I had a chapter on what are called human universals. I'm sorry to be coughing so much. I still have
maybe you can maybe drink a little bit of water.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
I think you're welcome. I think that another important element into this conversation is the question of a homogenic society. In a homogenic society, it's easier to protect those values, and people will feel more empathy and connected with each other. And multiculturalism, I'm speaking about homogenic societies. And when you have multiculturalism, then it's a little harder to feel, I don't know how to say it. Maybe I shouldn't. But I think you understand. In a society where you live with people who are like you, it's more likely that you would want to help, and you would feel safer to help.
Yes, I think you're right. And that's why I oppose multicultural policy. I think multicultural policy has been incredibly damaging and a misleading notion of nationhood. For example, our own Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, describes Canada as the world's first post-national state. And he said that after promoting multiculturalism as being the core value of Canada. And I reply to him, I say, well, multiculturalism has never been Canada's core value. We've always been multi-ethnic. We've always had people here from various ethnic regions of the world, but we've never been multicultural in the sense of trying to impose upon them a single cultural mode of existence called multiculturalism, like some kind of abstract policy where anything goes and any cultural policy is as good as any other, which of course is unnatural. You know, I come from a English-speaking cultural world, and I value my literary and philosophical tradition immensely, and my political tradition. A lot of people who come to Canada do not share that literary tradition, so to hell with it. It's disappearing from the schools. Even what we used to call great books tradition of teaching great books in the Western tradition have been disappearing from the schools because we're now multicultural. So let's have a book from an Indian culture or an Eskimo culture or Aboriginal culture or whatever. Let's have everything that we can and call it a good society. But the trouble is it leads to fragmentation. And I have said before, and I'll say it again, you can have diversity within unity, but you cannot derive unity from diversity. And this is the huge mistake that multicultural theorists have been making, thinking that you can get unity from diversity. It's impossible. There has to be some magnet under the table, and when you throw the iron filings on the table, they all go cha-chung and they point towards the magnet. They all point in the same direction. Cultures are like that. Cultural values, which are very strong and not skin deep, but deep cultural values, as I call them, are like the magnet in a society. Every citizen is like an iron filing, and you know what happens. You sprinkle them on the table, and then you put the magnet under the table, and they all align themselves with it. Invisibly, you can't touch magnetism, and you can't touch culture, but you can see it in action, just like you see those iron filings lining up. At any rate, natural law is like that. And I think my definition, a command of right reason, it's a command which we sense and we feel within ourselves naturally. People all over the world feel it. It's a command of right reason. In other words, your mind has applied itself to this feeling and you're reasoning correctly about what you should be doing, not incorrectly, because you can always reason incorrectly and defeat this whole thing. That follows nature for the common good. It doesn't follow nature for evil, because some people will say, well, it's natural to kill or it's natural to whatever, but it follows nature for the common good. Now, this idea of the common good in the Western democracies has been kind of sidelined in the recent past in favor of what I call the hyper-individual reality or hyper-democratic reality. We no longer think, really, of the common good. But the notion of the common good, and maybe we can have a session on this sometime, is very powerful in the West, especially since Rousseau, who rooted his entire social contract theory on the idea of what he called the general will. And the general will was basically another way of talking about the common good, where when a society comes to vote, it doesn't just tally up all the votes, all the individual or what he called particular wills or particular votes. We don't just tally up those and say, well, you win and you lose. What he was interested in was the general will, which was when citizens surrender their particular desires and particular wills, and they focus on the good of all, or what is often called the common good. Now, I happen to live in a society here where when we go to vote, nobody's thinking about the common good. What everybody's thinking about is this candidate good for me, good for my business, good for my community, good for my streets or my snow clearing or whatever it is the issue is. They're not asking themselves what's good for the country as a whole. And when Burke first got elected by the electors of the town of Bristol, the city of Bristol, there was an eruption because some of the electors said, Here's why I voted for you. I wanted you to do A, B, C for me. And Burke wrote a famous letter, which you should look up. It's only a page and a half. It's called A Letter to the Electors of Bristol, in which he outlined the fact that he was elected, and his talents were elected to choose for the common good, not just for the electors who put him there. So this idea in itself, you see, comes into conflict with the idea of direct democracy, which I think has some virtues, but direct democracy, such as they have in Switzerland, for example, and which people like me have advocated in limited doses for Canada, I now begin to see as contrary to that theory. It's not asking you to think or vote for the common good. It's asking you to vote for whatever is particular to you and your local community, and to hell with the common good. Anyway, now let me move to Bentham's main critiques of the idea of human rights. First of all, he said, because the Declaration was kind of an echo of Rousseau, Rousseau's social contract was the Bible of the French Revolution. And quite a few of the revolutionists who eventually went to the guillotine were clutching Rousseau's social contract book to their chests when they lost their heads. But his basic opening line was, all men are born free and are everywhere in chains. And Bentham's first reaction was the same as mine. But this is nonsense, he said. All men are born 100% dependent. They're surrounded by law and by legal and customary and traditional limitations, and they're subject to the rule and the whim and the care of their parents. There's nothing free about it. So he starts out attacking the very first words of the very first article of the French Declaration. And no one's ever been able to make the contrary argument, because he's quite correct. So what Rousseau was promoting was an illusion that all men are born free. And of course, his notion was that men are naturally good. This was a profoundly anti-Christian notion, by the way. So the Christian notion is that men are not really born good or born evil. They're born capable of both. And the whole purpose of things like the Ten Commandments and other Gospels in the Christian Bible, and the same is true with many other biblical religions or Bible or religions of the book, is that human beings need that guidance, and they need that example, or they may go in the wrong direction. So that was his first objection to Rousseau. But Rousseau's idea was we're born good. He then said that society corrupts us, and that's why with the social contract, he wanted to rejig all human societies and turn them into better societies, because society had corrupted the naturally good nature of all human beings and made us bad, covetous, and selfish, and all that. And with his idea of the general good and teaching us to surrender our particular wills and adopt the general will for the good of all, he would convert a bad society into a good society. And that just took off in France. I mean, intellectuals loved it. They thought it was fantastic. But what it came down to was, who's going to decide what the good society is on each particular policy that comes over the transom? And as it turned out, there was something called the Committee of Public Safety, which the Assembly created, and its main job was to rule on what was the general will and what was not, which means suddenly we had a dictatorial power deciding for everybody what the general will was, rather than everybody deciding by expressing it themselves. It became a dictatorial regime, and that's where it turned bad. By the way, it was a natural outgrowth of the social contract document and of the Declaration, because when before the Declaration became reality, the king had a veto. The monarch had a veto on the laws, and then that got diminished, and he had what was called a suspensive veto, which means he could suspend the work of Parliament. He could suspend the work of the lawmakers and to give them time to think more about what they were doing. But in the end, the lawmakers voted to get rid of the suspensive veto of the king. And when they did that, they got rid of all impediments to them deciding for themselves what was in the interest of the general will and what wasn't. No more arguments, no more discussion, no more differences of opinion permitted. So that's when they became most revolutionary, and that's when the terror really got started, and they started chopping off all those heads. Well, the second point Bentham makes I've already made, which is that there are no rights without corresponding obligations on others. His way of putting it was to say that a liberty given to one must be taken from another. Now, this is just a truism. It's like taxation. If you're going to give something free to Joe, you got to pay for it somehow as a government. You do that by taking the money from John to give the free gimme to Joe. So there's no such thing as government giving you something for free. And I always told my kids from the day they were born, don't ever say that anything is free. Say that it's prepaid, because someone has paid for this. It's been taken from someone, maybe even from you, before it was given back to you in the form of a government gift or a gimme or something like that. So no rights without corresponding obligations. That's simply a philosophical truth of all mankind. And it doesn't matter whether it's a personal obligation, like you want to marry somebody. I have a right to marry. It means someone has an obligation to marry me. It's different if you say I have a right to be married if I so choose. I have a right within the law to become a married person. That's a different from saying I have a right to marry, to make someone marry me. Can't happen. Thirdly, he said the statement that all men are born equal in rights, he felt, was simply not true. It was not true in his society, and it's really not true in ours, because there are differences between the rights of the wealthy and the poor, the apprentice and the master, the parent and the child, the ward and the guardian, the teacher and the student, and so on. So just in terms of the way human life, is conducted, it's not true that everybody's equal in rights or in the conduct of their lives in terms of equal rights. Fourthly, he said government by contract is historically false. No government has ever been established by contract. All governments have been historically, and I think this is true, have been established by custom, by force, or by habit, but not by contract. So right away he's opposing important elements of the French Declaration by declaring them to be historically false. And fifthly, he argued that if rights are unlimited, and the French Declaration didn't limit them in any way, then this itself is against all laws, because all laws, he said, are repugnant to so-called imprescriptible natural rights. Well, if you have an imprescriptible natural right, then any law is repugnant to that right. So you're talking about a recipe for persistent revolution when you start taking the position of natural rights. The idea of unlimited rights, he said, this is point 6, is a recipe, therefore, for perpetual revolution and resistance to law. And that's why Bentham said that natural rights are a tool of the anarchist. And, of course, this is what we saw happen in French history. The revolution became anarchism. And then the French got Napoleon, and I think the argument of one of the most fabulous and influential modern French historians named François Furet, in his book called Penser la Révolution Française, or Rethinking the French Revolution, which was itself a revolutionary historical document. His idea was that Napoleon was a new monarch. He was a consequence of the revolution and not the opposite of it. He came to power because the revolution had basically rejected traditional monarchy in favor of a new type of natural rights monarch. By the way, the other day in the newspaper, I saw a little placard being held up by somebody here saying sex workers' rights are human rights. So there's another one, you see. Sex workers' rights are now human rights. That's the next little platform here to protect selling your body as a human right. My concern in all of this is really that the concept of human rights becomes a tool for progressives and for international organizations and what they call NGOs or non-governmental organizations to reorganize human societies. And now, if you'll permit me, I'd like to end with something I wrote about that in my War Against the Family book, in which I did a kind of mini critique of two rights treaties to which Canada signed on, and I bet you Israel signed on to them too. You can tell me if that's true or not. So I'm talking about the manipulation of rights at the international level here. This section is called Turning Wrongs into Rights. The chapter is called that. And I'm speaking now on the international level, changing the family from afar. It is a strange but telling fact that the very same interest groups that characterized the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States as an oppressive invasion of Canadian rights and freedoms, they welcome with open arms international treaties that propose to restructure Canadian social and family life along liberal egalitarian lines. And this probably applies to your country too. International law has become the new focus for dreamlanders and one-worlders hoping to collectivize all of humanity. Two notable treaties that Canada and other nations have recently signed and ratified are already having a powerful effect, and they bid fair to further weaken the bonds of family life throughout the free world. Both these documents are a good read, and it is possible they may have some beneficial effect in tyrannical nations or where social conditions are deplorable. But then, do tyrannical nations really care what anyone else thinks? I don't think so. In a free country such as ours, or any other free country, they spell only trouble and more top-down control from meddling bureaucrats. The first I want to talk about is the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Canada co-sponsored the initial resolution for this convention. Canada has been a busybody in the rights domain. It co-sponsored this resolution, which was subsequently adopted by the UN General Assembly. Having played a large role in drawing up the convention, Canada then felt pressure to ratify it, which it did in October of 1981. It is a matter of some curiosity how such conventions, which are binding on signatory nations, managed to get ratified, listen to this, with no national discussion whatsoever. This one was heavily promoted and steered by ubiquitous radical feminists in my country and many other countries too. Once ratified, all other national laws must be aligned with this treaty. Well, no one likes discrimination, so why would we complain? There'd be no problem, except that such abstract documents always seem to constitute a license to invade traditional society. So we need to ask about the ideological thrust of this convention and about what it directs lawmakers to do. Well, does this sound like it's focused on discrimination against women? Here we go. The preamble of the convention calls for a, quote, new economic order, unquote. Now, this is a tip-off for its redistributionist, socialist mentality. They're not shy about begging these people. They want other people to pay for the things that they want. It also calls for, quote, I'm quoting right from the document, general and complete disarmament, and in particular, nuclear disarmament, unquote. A nice thought, perhaps, but it does not mention how we are to protect the peace. You know, the Romans said years ago, it's still a great saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. It's the only way you're going to have peace, is to prepare for war. There's even a list of wish fulfillment in this document about racism, colonialism, and so on. And of course, these topics have become very heated in recent times. The preamble calls not for equal opportunities for all women, but for, quote, maximum participation of women on equal terms with men, unquote. In other words, to hell with the free market and what a woman or a man might be able to freely command by way of a job or a wage or a job description. There is no mention whatever of the millions of women around the world who prefer to stay home to raise their children and look after their families. That is their job. Every single health and welfare benefit mentioned in the convention applies only to women in the labor force, and there's no mention of part-time employment. There's an obsessive thrust in this document to the effect that women of the world ought to leave their families and enter the workforce full-time as autonomous economic units, fully protected by the state. And in my talk for you about Sweden and the Swedish welfare state, we saw how for them in the 50s and afterwards, that was a programmatic, compulsive, basically command of their government. They wanted women out of the house. They wanted every individual to be an independent worker and taxpayer, a full-time, autonomous economic unit. I mean, talk about bowing to the forces of economic reality. Gender quotas will be created to enforce this effort. And this is 30 years ago I wrote this. And what do we see today? We have gender quota legislation in Canada. They want 50% of all corporate boards to be women. This is an offense against free society and free corporations. It's the end of a free corporation if you're forced to put certain people on your board that you might not otherwise have put. Well, now you might have. There's no law in Canada that says you can't put all women on your board if you want to, or all men, or any mixture in between. But why would a government come along and say now they want 50% women on every corporate board in the country? There's been a reaction, of course, from corporations simply because they see themselves as having their freedoms cut.
They're going to lose a lot of money if it will be forced.
Oh, absolutely, because shareholders will rightly object and say, look, if you have fantastic women on your board, I have no complaint. But I don't want them there just because they're women. Yeah. What the hell, you know?
Should be based on merit and abilities.
Yeah, and they're trying to do legislation. They're trying to do the same in Parliament, where they want 50% of all government seats in Parliament to be female. Of course, you know where it goes after that. We don't just want female seats. We want homosexual seats. We want black seats. We want handicap seats, everything you can imagine.
And don't forget trannies eventually.
Yeah. Bisexual seats or whatever, you know. I mean, it's crazy.
Oh, it's delusional.
Yeah. So the egalitarian edicts of this convention are so broad that they could mandate all women for military service and authorize the end of single-sex institutions such as schools, convents, and prisons, all in fulfillment of their badly flawed androgynous ideal. Other articles promote state daycare for all. Yeah, state daycare. In other words, if you don't have any kids, that's too bad. You're going to be taxed to support daycare for those who do. And they order the state to, this document orders the state, orders it to provide, quote, family planning services, unquote, as a right to all women. So they want the state to provide, meaning freely, you know, contraceptives, IUD devices, birth control pills, and free abortions to anybody who wants them. Okay? In other words, contraceptives and abortion as a right. See, again, as I say, if you have a right to an abortion, then it means you can force someone else to provide the right, even if they don't want to. Planned Parenthood has already jumped on this bandwagon. Actually, it's a bedwagon with its international document called the Human Right to Family Planning. Yeah, they did. However, if as a parent you don't wish your 13-year-old daughter to be provided with such things, your authority is now effectively undermined by busybody bureaucrats at the United Nations. The convention, in fact, committed Canada and other countries to provide free access to abortion, as I say. You get it? This policy was imposed from the top and it filtered down. It was not decided by Canadian people from the bottom up. The court party, which is a phrase we use to decide on those who get what they want through the courts rather than through legislation, looks to conventions like this for guidance on such matters and not to voting citizens. These are ways of bypassing the democratic routines of modern democratic societies. You do an end run around them. To hell with democracy. We can't get what we want with democracy. The people won't allow it. So we're going to do it through the courts and through conventions like the UN, which we're going to sign on to without even talking to the people about it, and then force these policies on them. This convention also calls for measures to, quote, listen to this, modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women, unquote. So they're asking, the convention is trying to force the nation to modify social and cultural patterns. Well, this goes back to the old progressive idea that there's no such thing as human nature. You can make it into whatever you want. You just have to modify social and cultural patterns by force and by policy. That's quite opposed to the fundamentally Christian and conservative view of human nature, which is that it's neither good or bad. It's capable of great evil and great good, and basically is pretty much the same throughout history. You can't really change it. And so you should make laws accordingly and not try to adjust human nature by way of the laws. But in short, this is Big Brother via the United Nations and the so-called anti-sexist, their phrase, programs of re-education, their phrase, are proposed to break down, again, their phrase, stereotypes of the traditional family. I mean, what a cheeky bunch of people, calling your love and affection and emotional bonding to the traditional family a stereotype. They're humiliating you and your human love of your own family. Now, this task, which they're setting for our nations, includes purging all school textbooks that in any way promote traditional sexual and marital patterns. Wow. Curiously, the so-called, get this, listen up, the so-called committee of experts from 23 nations who were appointed to monitor compliance with this convention, in other words, to police it, included 19 dictatorships and 14 nations blacklisted by Amnesty International for the use of torture. That's on the record. Here they are telling us how to live. During a January 1985 review of Canada's progress, they called it progress, a whole range of countries from this international committee chided us, encouraging us to get moving. The Soviet Union, of all things, which hadn't fallen, it fell the year after this book came out, and I predicted that it would fall in this book, by the way. The Soviet Union said more had to be done to change traditional stereotypes in Canada. And I asking in brackets, maybe concentration camps would do the job, close the bracket. And that all men had to be, quote, directed to do more parenting. Rwanda, of all countries, wanted Canada to do more to, quote, protect homosexuality, unquote. I guess Rwanda ought to know about that. Mongolia complained about limited access to abortion in Canada. I mean, does Mongolia even have a hospital? Really? East Germany complained of, quote, limited childcare in Canada. And I say, when the Berlin Wall came down, did all the Germans run to the east? I don't think so. Well, there was much more of the same, mostly from countries world famous for their own incompetence. And now, if you have the patience, I'll finish up with my critique of just one more convention, which called the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Rights of the Child. This time it's about giving children rights and enforcing them. Now, please note, there's never been a resolution or a convention at the United Nations to create a charter of family rights. Not by government. They turn their backs on traditional family rights because they're progressive by nature, or of parental rights, and for one good reason. Egalitarians, as witnessed throughout this book, they hate the family. Don't be fooled by the language of their quest, because there can never be any such thing as children's rights. And that's because children are too young to exercise rights. And so someone must always exercise rights for them. And usually it's against their parents. So the only possible rights here are those of the state against the authority of the natural family. Now, and sometimes in places, these powers could be a good thing. And it would be wonderful to cleanse the world miraculously of all injustice to children everywhere. Surely that's the most sorrowful of all forms of evil. It would be especially nice if we could cleanse the world of all injustices to children brought about by the state itself in various parts of the world. Among these, one could number almost every famine in the history of the world, all wars and genocides, all revolutions, all concentration camps, all torture systems, and almost limitless other indescribable infamies carried out in the name of what Irving Babbitt called the Sparta of their dreams. And that's how he described all utopian schemes, as the Sparta of their dreams. That was Plato's dream. The family has been the victim, never the perpetrator in any of these things. So let's look at this convention too, and ask how it is that Canada's Prime Minister rushed off to sign it. This was on May 28th in 1990, with no discussion, again, from the nation's 6 million families, or 7 million now. At present, Canada and its provinces and about 150 other countries are adjusting their own laws to be in full compliance with this convention, which in September of 1990, quote, took on the force of international law in all ratifying countries, unquote. Canada's signing, authorized by an order in council of our own cabinet, required no debate from the parliament of this country, a land based on freedom, family, free enterprise, and faith. And there was, and there is still, very little knowledge of it among the Canadian people. Nevertheless, all our courts are bound to take the convention into consideration as a guideline to interpreting Canadian law. The question, again, is simply this: how can a treaty that will eventually reach into every home in the country and restructure most parent-child relations be signed and ratified without the full knowledge of the Canadian people, or the people in any country where this is true? Here are just a few remarks of my own on some of the more meddlesome provisions of this Convention on the Rights of the Child. Article 13 grants children, quote, the right to freedom of expression, including the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, either orally, in writing, or in the form of art, or through any other media of the child's choice, unquote. Wow. This wording means that parents will have no enforceable right to control such matters as the type of sex education offered to or sexual experimentation by their own children in the schools. Nor will parents have the right to control what television programs, movies, pornographic magazines, videos, or books their children are allowed. As you can imagine, this is a children's right eagerly supported by the mega-billion-dollar North American entertainment, magazine, video, and music industry. And Planned Parenthood is already using this right to prevent concerned parents from halting the free distribution of condoms throughout the schools and every sex clinic in the land to their underage children. Article 14 says, parents shall respect the right of the child to freedom of thought, conscience of religion. The parents are only allowed to provide direction to the child in the exercise of these rights. This means you no longer will be able to require your 10-year-old to go to church, to say grace at the table, or take religious training at Sunday school. It may also mean that you will have to censor passages of the Bible. For example, when it condemns homosexuality, sodomy, or adultery. Mustn't offend those little minds with decency, after all. This article also means that if your sweet little Amanda decides to become a satanic cultist or engrave swastikas all over your house and hex her little brother, you will have little to stand on in court when it comes to prohibiting her. Amanda, dear, I'd like to give you some direction today. That's not what you're going to hear. Article 15 grants the child the right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly. It sounds good, but I mean, it's no problem if a 14-year-old kid wants to join the Boy Scouts. But it may quickly become a problem if he joins the Hells Angels instead, or some violent other motorcycle gang. Article 16 grants children a right to privacy, and privacy rights, of course, can be used for all sorts of things. Your little darling may decide that what goes on in his bedroom is his own business, not yours. Quote, I'm saying, dear, what was that acrid smell drifting from your room last night? And all that groaning when your friends came over? And was that glass I heard breaking? You haven't allowed me in your room since we bought this house 5 years ago. Couldn't I have a look, please? That's the kind of situation parents are going to be in when parents have such a right to privacy, absolute right to privacy. Article 17 charges the state with the job of encouraging the, quote, mass media to disseminate information to the child, even though our children already spend more time in front of the TV than they do in the classroom. Article 18 says all parents have the right to child care services from the state. This is more mandated socialism. From the UN Article 24 that orders the signing states to develop, quote, family planning, education, and services. It's a direct interference with what you saw was your parental right vis-a-vis the sexual education of your child. And it's also a euphemism for tax-funded abortion on demand and state-supplied contraceptives. This provision basically lends international support to legions of sexologists and abortion counselors, vacuum tube in hand, saving humanity from itself. Despite the fact that the preamble to the convention says, at the insistence only of the U.S., Ireland, and the Vatican, that the child, by reason of his physical and mental immaturity, needs special safeguards and care, including legal protection, before as well as after birth, Canada refused to make such a commitment. Article 27, in other words, is a catch-all, feel-good clause promising the ever-present socialist panacea and the right of children to a good standard of living, quote, adequate for physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development, unquote. This would normally make everyone feel warm all over, except that it means more taxes, legions of government inspectors, counselors, supervisors, therapists, and welfare statists, and general interference with family life. From what I've discovered about public education, an inexpensive way for Canada to bring about all these mandated conditions of adequacy for our children and to pay off the deficit at the same time would be to privatize the public schools. At any rate, I should close up now and say that these things are just a partial list of what these conventions are doing. It's about statists selling the idea that the state knows best and that the home is just an extension of the school. Overzealous social workers eager to demonstrate abuse by parents or punishment they think too severe, and even harsh words may qualify here. Sexologists, the homosexual lobby, and the like, who will be empowered to spread their influence further. Textbook producers will reinforce their one-world universalist agenda. Bureaucrats who want to limit homeschooling and religious schools will become strident. Abortion rights activists pushing reproductive care will be energized. State child care advocates will try harder for grants, of course, and the purveyors of pornography and salacious music will cite freedom of information as a children's right. So there you go. I have no more to say about it, except that I have concluded, as you can see from what I have read you in my own work, that the notion of human rights itself has fallen easily into the hands of politically manipulative organizations that want to restructure the entire Western world and every country in it.
It's a weapon. Earlier you said, and I would like to ask, what is the source of all the famines, wars, and genocides? What did you say the source of that was?
The state. These are all brought about by states. If you want to read,
yeah, I agree. I'm aware. You can, for example, look into the book of this Hawaiian professor, democide, and stuff like that. But okay, so you just said that the source is the state, and we know that those policymakers are using the state and the international organizations to be able to push their agendas. So shouldn't we have the duty to rescue ourselves from the state and those policymakers?
I couldn't agree more. I've been selling that idea for 40 years.
I'm just using this thing that you said earlier about saving the woman who was raped, and I just say, let's save everyone from the rape of the state. And the one thing I find to be a bit hypocritic is why those policymakers who are so hot about abortion, why is it that they didn't exercise the right to abortion on themselves and their genetic lines? That would solve a lot of problems.
Yes. Well,
I mean, demonstrate it by yourself. Show us how to do it.
Yeah. Well, this gets us into that whole area, which I have thought and written an awful lot about in my life. And I don't think it's made much of a dent on the way people think about this. They simply take for granted, my body, my choice. And this is how democratic theory and the right to abortion come together in the public mind. And whenever you go to a demonstration about the right to abortion, you can see the placards they're holding up. My body, my choice. They never ask themselves why choice legitimizes anything. People can choose all kinds of evil things, as I have said many times, and they often do. And abortion is one of them. So you can't use the idea of choice to legitimize the killing of perfectly healthy children in the womb. But everyone takes that for granted now as a human right. Now, I personally think that if you sit down and actually think about it long enough, you will see the connection between the affection for human rights and the affection for actions like the abortion of unborn children, and how those two things have come together in our world. That's why I like to shoot down the notion of rights, and I prefer to take the Burkean position of tradition and custom and traditional morality as our only hope. And religion, of course, is, what is traditional morality? It's the shadow of religion. So as we see religion fall, and I think we're living on the moral surplus of these dying religions right now. But we are living on it, at least. There's still some resistance. And of course, we saw in the recent American judgment in Roe versus Wade, they didn't end the so-called right to abortion, but they ended it being a federal right. And now it's gone back to the states, many of whom have already banned it completely, which is what they wanted to do in the first place.
Yes. I just want to say that you absolutely have influence on people. You said you didn't even have a dent or something like that. Just think about it. You have influenced hundreds of Israelis who are listening to your work, and you straight them up. So I'm sure you have huge influence in Canada.
Well, thank you for saying that. Some people do tell me that, but I have to say, it's been like, it's been like battling a tsunami. I saw the tsunami coming before most people did, and I wrote books like The Trouble with Canada to resist the oppressive nature of the welfare state. And then I wrote The War Against the Family, which really dug deeply into all these issues. But, the wave was upon me then. And that's why I say when people ask me, how have you felt? Having done this for almost 40 years, I say, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's a good image. I feel like a man standing on a rock in a leftward drifting sea. And I see ships in the distance drifting to the left, and I hear voices. And what the voices are saying is, look, there's a man out there drifting to the right. And I haven't moved, but I have been positioned as a so-called far right thinker. And there's nothing far right about me. I'm the most traditionalist kind of Edmund Burke type thinker in social matters, and very libertarian in economic matters. And I think those are easily put together. But I resist libertarianism in social matters, and because I think it's done tremendous damage. And it has fed us as what I call hyper-individuals into the hands of the marauding state. And nothing the state likes more than dealing just with individuals. It doesn't want to deal with families. Families are a powerful force when they get together. Like, imagine those 7 million families in my country uniting against a government policy. It would be very powerful. They wouldn't dare push it forward. But when they can take you on as an individual, one by one, and shoot you down or win you over by giving you, goodies, tax goodies and all that kind of stuff, they win you over. And that's why libertarianism has been a part of the problem in modernity. Much as I have saluted it in the past for defending us against the state, it does not do anything to defend us in terms of the social good. It has no concept of the good, actually. It only has a concept of harm. Do whatever you want as long as you don't harm someone else. And it calls that the good. But that's not sufficient for a human society to hold together, in my opinion. You need concepts of the good and of good behavior. And we get those from the natural law and from the ethics of the religions, which have shaped us so profoundly over the last 2,000 years and longer, in order to hold together,
Yes.
So
I would just say that while everyone is drifting left, they are going to stand on quicksand, while you stand maybe a little bit isolated on rock solid. So by the time they are going to destroy everything, eventually they will have to look back to the right where you stand on that rock, and they will come to ask for advice. So
I see some of their fingers on the rock already.
Please help.
Yeah.
When are we going to see you again?
Well, why don't we talk about what's next? I don't know. I've kind of run out of all the things I like to talk about, although it really doesn't stop. So maybe we could try in a couple of weeks, do a Q&A session just for fun and see where it goes.
Okay. I love that. We should. So
That'll
I
be
will
fun.
communicate with you via the email, and I will also send you a link to the video now. I will prepare it very quickly, and I will send you so you can add it to your YouTube channel.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, as always. It's always a pleasure. You're so amazing, really. The kind of information you bring is absolutely extremely important. So I appreciate that.
You're very patient. Thank you.
See you next time, and take good care of your health.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye for now.